Hello, good afternoon everybody and welcome to the first webinar from the Centre for the New Midlands. Formally launched in May of this year, the Centre is an independent think tank focused on the development and dissemination of new ideas to build a better region. My name is Keith Jeffrey and I'll be comparing today's session on behalf of the Centre for the New Midlands. I run breakthrough coaching and consulting. My job is to help leaders achieve breakthroughs in their thinking for themselves and their organisations, and I work with leaders from the social, cultural, creative sectors. So today's webinar will consider the question: what role can community-led housing play in the Midlands housing mix post-COVID-19? In today's session, we'll hear from a variety of different speakers from across the sector and region who will share their thoughts on the concept of community-led housing, how it is currently being used, and what the potential is for community-led housing in the West Midlands. Before I begin, I'd like to draw attention to the chat and Q&A features. If you want to make a comment, please use them as a feature. On behalf of the Centre of New Midlands, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Benfield Homes for the sponsorship of today's session and the broader Housing and Communities workstream. Founded in 1933, Benfield Homes remains a family-owned company that has established a reputation for traditionally built, high-quality new homes for the discerning buyer, whether they be first-time buyers, downsizers, growing families, and investors alike. A huge thank you again for your support. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Tom Chance. Tom is Joint Chief Executive of the National Community Land Trust Network. Prior to joining the network, he worked for the Greater London Authority in Housing and Planning Policy and as Head of Office for the Green Party Group on the London Assembly. He's also worked for a sustainable construction company and as a consultant for clients such as the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Housing and Planning, World Habitat, Phases, and various local authorities. So, over to you, Tom.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I'm going to talk now about community-led housing in the rest of the country, not including the West Midlands, to talk about how that might unlock, or how we could use those as examples to unlock capacity in the West Midlands for delivering housing and other forms of long-term economic and social value. First, I thought it would be helpful just to start with a definition of what we mean by community-led housing. This definition was worked on by a whole range of different national bodies representing housing co-ops, community land trusts, co-housing communities, self-help, self-build, and so on, a few years ago, and has now been adopted by national governments and local regional government around the country, and helps to just put a bit of a boundary for us around what we do and don't mean by community-led housing, and also still to leave a lot of flexibility in here for a whole variety of approaches and innovation to occur. So we're not totally prescriptive about what we mean by community-led housing. Probably the key thing in this definition to focus on is owning and managing or stewarding homes in the manner of their choosing. And it's that choosing bit of it which often makes community-led housing different, that communities are in the driving seat in terms of what their role might be in the provision and management of housing. I thought I'd actually now start just with an example where I live. So I'm in Crystal Palace in southeast London, and around here, one of the councils, Croydon, has identified lots of small sites like these little red lines here. These are some garages in between some blocks of flats and houses. And they're looking to develop all these little infill sites with their own housing company they set up called Brick by Brick. It's bringing forward proposals like this one and working with some quite high quality architects and trying to get them developed with a target of 50% of the housing being affordable housing. What's interesting when you look at the marketing brochure for the homes that are being sold, these are the kinds of things that they talk about, and it's similar with other companies that develop houses in this area. They talk about it being moments from the buzzing triangle with lots of independent shops. They talk about the community vibe in the area. There's a music festival which was set up by the local community. There's a regular Saturday food market. And if you look at these are all things that are set up by local people, whether social enterprises, businesses, or community organisations. And they're creating the value in the area that is making those homes saleable, that makes them kind of valuable and people want to be able to come and buy them. And this is the community, and this is who we mean when we talk about community-led housing. And yet, in that conventional housing system, the community is way off on the side, or if not in the picture at all. So I sit on the board of an industry body called the Housing Forum, which brings together these 5 stakeholder groups you see in the middle here. And the ethos, the idea is that getting good collaboration and good partnership between these different parts of the system will deliver good results. When the local authority, the housing association, and its suppliers, consultants, and builder all work well together. But community is never included in that conversation. And we never think that community normally we don't think of community having anything to contribute, despite recognizing that community is actually creating the value around those homes. And the idea of community-led housing is just that the community could actually contribute more value in the development of the housing itself. Croydon has acknowledged this and is actually one of the leading councils in the country now in working in partnership with community-led housing groups, and it set up a process whereby some of the small sites are now being developed by Brick, its housing company, in partnership with community-led housing organisations. And the first one in my local area is being delivered by a community land trust, and that CLT is in control of the development, but using the development expertise and capacity and skills of the housing company to make sure that development goes forward successfully. Brighton is another council that has really embraced this. They have lots of small sites similar to many cities, where in this case it's one in between lots of back gardens, very, very sensitive. And when local people here got wind of the fact that this site was going to be developed, a lot of them were quite worried and potentially opposed to what was being proposed. But this was actually taken forward by a co-op, which was set up by low-income families in Brighton who aren't sufficiently low income to get really high up the waiting list for social housing. There's obviously a huge waiting list in Brighton for their social housing stock, but also struggle in the private rented sector where they live at the moment with high rents and low quality housing. So they set up a co-op so that they could rent homes basically from themselves at rent that just was as low as needed, as high as is needed to cover the cost of building their homes. So they formed in 2015. They identified this site and some others around the council, around the city. This one's owned by the city council, so they are leasing it from the council for 99 years. They're being financed by the Ecology Building Society, and they've now actually completed 2 homes on this site, and they've got 2 more schemes in planning. And Brighton is looking at how it can use its assets and its planning system to facilitate more opportunities like this, where local residents can be coming in and solving their own housing problems, taking themselves off the council's waiting list in the process. A quite different type of infill. This is a council estate in Bermondsey in Zone 1, London. It's run by Leathermarket CBS, which, well, there's a tenant management organisation which manages about 1,500 homes in the area. And they did an exercise with their own residents looking at what sorts of issues they were facing. And obviously housing was one of their top concerns, where they have a lot of people who are either overcrowded in their homes or potentially under-occupying with an unsuitable home, which doesn't meet their needs because of some new disability or some other need they have. And so they identified an opportunity to build more housing in their estate on little infill sites. Things like, again, redundant garages and underused car parking space. So they set up a community benefit society to take these developments forward. They're working with the council, which owns the land and is providing the development finance. They're leading the process of engaging their community, developing a proposal, and then building out with a developer called Igloo. Their first scheme they completed somewhat time ago. It was for 27 new social rent homes. They've got 40 being built on site at the moment, and they've got more schemes potentially coming through. So giving the community a leading role in infilling and regenerating their estate, rather than thinking somebody else needs to come in from outside and do it for them. Another infill scheme, this is in Bristol, in Knoll West. It's a large Homes for Heroes 1930s council estate in the south of the city. Again, it's one that is a very deprived part of Bristol. It's often talked about as a problem, and as though what we need to do is bring people in to solve the problem. The people who live there, including those who run a local arts organisation, identified that they've got 2 key assets. They've got a lot of land in their estate that's being underused, and they've got a lot of people living there who work in the trades and have a huge amount of skill to be able to bring to develop new housing. So they did an exercise to identify all these little bits of infill land where there's a bit of a gap between some houses, or there's somebody who's got a really big back garden they're not using, and they identified space for at least 1,500 homes in those infill sites, plus another 1,000 homes on larger sites. And they did a big exercise with the local community to kind of gain buy-in for a kind of pattern book of development, the sorts of infill development people would be happy to see in the area. They built a prototype home which people could stay in. They have factory, which they use as a kind of maker space, which they're going to use to be able to build a lot of the components for this housing. And they've recently submitted planning permission for the first 2 homes they'd like to build, with the intention of rolling this out throughout the estate. So in an area where often suburban densification is a hot topic, and to say the least, and it's very controversial, giving the local community the ability to take the lead in suburban densification can really change the conversation and bring people round to supporting it, and also to making sure that those new homes are being built to meet the needs of the people who live there already. So a lot of the homes they've already basically identified, this is the person who's giving up the land in their garden or next to their house, and this is the family that's going to move into the house that's being built. On a very different scale, we can also see community-led housing happening on large-scale new development on kind of greenfield sites. So this is in East Cambridgeshire, where the District Council has been strongly supportive of CLTs, community land trusts, for about a decade. And there have been several smaller schemes being developed in villages of sort of 50, 70 homes. But this is a village that is going to be tripled in size with a 500-home garden village development. And the community formed a community land trust to take it forward on the assumption that this is probably going to happen either way, and we'd much rather be in control of it and make sure it's going to bring benefit to our community than to just sit back and have it kind of roll over. And they put the scheme to the vote of their members. So many people in the village joined the community land trust to be part of this process. They had a big debate about whether to do it. And about 65% of the members of the community land trust voted in favour of going ahead with this large-scale development. The community has then been leading the process of master planning. So they worked with JTP, who did the master planning, and the council and their housing company. And JTP commented how, because the community was thinking about the fact that they're not just looking at how this might be designed, but they're also thinking, well, we are going to own all of the open space after this has been completed, and we're going to be owning and managing 10% of the homes. They were thinking about the long term. They were thinking about their role in stewardship, governing this, managing it, and how the whole thing could really work for generations to come. So this is a kind of approach to garden village development that goes back to the actual original garden cities of Letchworth, which was basically a massive community land trust, and is a model that could be working in parts of the West Midlands where there are plans for large scale urban extensions or new developments of this kind. Because of what's been happening around the country, there is increasing research and interest and guidance for local authorities in how to do this. So from left to right, there's a planner's guide, which was commissioned recently by Community First Yorkshire, which talks about how you can use both planning policy and development control to support community-led housing. There's a project done in London, which might be of interest to urban authorities in the West Midlands, looking at all the sort of groups being developed in London at the moment and how they can be supported. And a few years back, the Cooperative Councils Innovation Network did a specific piece of research looking at the role of local authorities in supporting community-led housing. And we see now that about 1 in 6 councils in the country has policy to support community-led housing, and 1 in 3 has either given policy or given grants or land. So it's pretty widespread, including in the West Midlands. Housing associations are also really valuable partners in this. You'll hear a bit later from Carl talking about the role of Accord and how they've supported a lot of new housing co-ops. In other parts of the country, they are working in partnership with community land trusts and co-ops and so on in a whole variety of ways. One that's really embraced this is Astor, which particularly works in the southwest of England and has developed a pattern of development where the community actually brings a site forward and identifies the landowner, undertakes a feasibility study, develops what's going to be built, takes it through planning, and the housing association comes in at that point to complete the planning process, to then build it out and to manage those homes. And the community retains the ownership of the land and leases, in effect, it to the housing association. And it's a partnership that brings the leadership and the stewardship of the local community together with the professional skills of the housing association has been highly successful. Government nationally has also embraced wanting to see this sector grow. One thing they point to is that if you look in many other European countries and parts of North America, these community-led approaches are actually very common. So it's totally normal in cities like Vienna or Berlin, Munich, Copenhagen, for large-scale urban regeneration and redevelopment to be taken forward by community-led organisations. And a lot of social housing in those countries is built as large-scale housing co-ops. So the government created the Community Housing Fund off the back of some of our campaigning to bring this kind of development forward. And their ambition was that with the right kind of investment, that they would increase this market. And that's really what we're trying to do, is increase this into being more of a viable part of the market in regions like the West Mids. Government also just very recently in the planning white paper has identified some policies they'd like to introduce to support this. So the idea of some sub-areas in growth areas specifically for community-led housing, and looking at how the public land could better support this as part of their agenda of diversifying the housing industry and helping communities to flourish. Now the challenge, which I guess we can explore in this seminar, is to go from little pockets of inspiration, and we'll hear today from some fantastic examples, to it being much more of a mainstream option. So it's not that you need some particular inspiring individual to promote and bring forward a scheme that gets lots of awards and then nothing else happens like it in the region. What we want is for this to be a mainstream option in the way that housing association development and other kind of private sector development is. So really what we need to think about is how can we make that happen in the West Midlands? What kind of policy framework do we create? How do we bring industry in and finance in to make that happen? Thank you very much. And you can see in this map, incidentally, where all the community land trusts are in the country. And there are clusters in places like East Cambridgeshire and the Southwest where we have begun to make that mainstreaming happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Our next speaker is Abigail Ryan, Development Manager for West Midlands Urban Community Homes. Abigail has recently joined the organisation and is currently working to establish it as a new hub for knowledge and expertise to inspire and support a new wave of community-led housing in the West Midlands. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you very much, Tom. Some great inspiration for the West Midlands there. I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of what the picture looks like in the West Midlands now, and then you'll hear from Carl and Aftal and Sharon about some more kind of detailed examples. The first thing to say is that we're building on a rich heritage of community-led housing in the West Midlands. So there are 26 cooperatives, 18 tenant management organisations, 6 self-help housing groups and 3 community associations that are well established in the region. So they already house over 37,000 people in over 16,000 homes. The second thing to say is that we have a new enabler hub for community-led housing. So as Keith introduced me, that's where I'm from. I'm the development manager for West Midlands Urban Community Homes. And we are a hub and a network of practitioners from a range of housing and community organisations around the region. We would like to inspire a new wave of community-led housing in West Midlands, and our vision is for 5% of homes built in West Midlands by 2031 to be community-led and see an increase in community control of existing homes. So what will it take to achieve this? We like to talk about 3 key things that you need to make community-led housing happen. That's people, land and finance. So on the people side, we need community engagement and activism. We also need the technical expertise and professional support required to make a project happen. I use land in the broadest possible sense. So that could be greenfield, brownfield, empty homes, other existing properties, heritage assets, you name it. On the finance side, we tend to need some revenue funding to plan and progress a project alongside the capital funding and finance for a build or refurbishment. Therefore, as a hub, there are kind of two core functions, two ways that we're trying to make this happen. We have an advisor support service, so our advisors can offer the advice and guidance that's needed to plan and deliver a community-led housing project. And we want to collaborate with a wide range of partners to help unlock that land and finance that's needed to enable community-led housing. What does a new wave of community-led housing look like? We talk about 3 routes to community-led housing. So the first is grassroots groups. So that's grassroots activists get together and decide that they want to build some homes for their local community. The second are existing community organisations. They may or may not be organisations that deliver housing historically, but they see a need in the local community. And the third is our developer initiated partnership. So this might be a local authority, a housing association, or a private developer who decide that they want their scheme or an element of it to be community led, and then go about the work of recruiting founding community members to take on that community stewardship role. So I'll just say a little bit about what the picture looks like in the West Midlands at the moment across each of these areas. So on grassroots groups, we are seeing a couple of co-housing groups emerging. So these are groups who would like to build developments of maybe 20 to 30 homes with an element of shared space and communal living. They're often very ambitious about environmental sustainability in the build, and very keen to provide affordable homes through some quite innovative and different tenures like mutual home ownership. Of course, we also see grassroots activism around proposed regeneration and developments, and we think that there is potential to harness that really positively and facilitate kind of groups that might emerge that way. And finally, we've seen a new community development trust and community land trust start to emerge over the last couple of years as well, and Carl might talk a little bit more about that. So there is energy on the ground, and as a hub, we kind of we want to build awareness of this as an option, and to start kind of generating some more activity at this grassroots level. In terms of existing community organisations, we are seeing a few community anchors who often don't deliver housing historically, identify needs and keen to develop affordable homes for particular groups. So there is one developing affordable homes for key workers, a couple for older people, for younger people, for homeless families and refugees. So these are groups who they would generally support. And they can see a housing need for them in their local area. There's another community organisation looking to preserve some heritage assets as homes. And there's also an example of a kind of a partnership of existing community organisations in an area who can see a housing need in the local area and see an opportunity and would like to establish kind of a new community development trust. And then there are also kind of the existing community housing organisations like cooperatives and almshouse charities who would like to develop more homes. And finally, on the developer initiated side, we're seeing a handful of registered providers looking to initiate the development of community-led housing. And again, you'll hear a bit more from Carl about that. We'd like to see local authority house builders and ALMOs doing the same thing, and as a hub, we'd like to support them in doing that. Section 106 agreements with developers is another area to explore as a vehicle for community-led housing. As Tom touched on, particularly with the Garden City example, we'd like to look for different ways to incorporate community-led housing into new settlements and regeneration areas. And we can look a bit further afield for inspiration on this as well, actually, for example, to Vienna, where they have run developer competitions with social sustainability as a key criteria for securing sites. And that has led to large-scale kind of resident participation and community governance across the sites, and pepper potting of community housing projects throughout larger settlements that can very quickly help them to develop into thriving neighbourhoods and develop community links. So finally, why would we do it? Fundamentally, this is about creating the homes that communities want and need. All of the examples that I've talked about are about creating affordable homes for local people. Many of them are also, as Tom talked about diversifying our housing market and providing increased housing choice with those co-housing schemes, for example, elements of communal living, other projects that are incorporating kind of live and work spaces, a real mixture of tenures. And then there are just a few kind of other regional challenges here on the list where we think community-led housing could really make an impact. So sustainable, resilient communities are obviously going to be core to COVID-19 recovery. And that's actually the DNA of community-led housing projects, as is community connection and tackling loneliness and social isolation. That community-led housing projects are really positive for the local economy, creating kind of spaces, mixed living, working, commercial spaces. Community groups are often really keen to use local supply chains and get the pound flowing around their local area. They're often very ambitious about environmental standards, so could make a real contribution to the transition to zero carbon. And as I mentioned before, on those developer models, there is a real potential for them to help to stabilise the new settlements that are planned in the region. So I'm going to pause there, and Carl and Afzal will tell you a bit more about these some of these projects in more detail. My contact details are here if you'd like to get in touch.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Abby. Just a reminder, if you wish to comment on any of the points raised so far, use the chat feature or use the Q&A at the bottom there. Our next speaker is Carl Taylor. Carl is Director at Redditch Cooperative Homes and Head of Strategy for Birmingham, and we're delighted to have you with us today. So over to you, Carl.
Mute myself. Hiya, I'm Carl Taylor. I work for Accord Housing Association. My job title is, that's an old review of me, I'm afraid. My job title is Assistant Director of New Business and Growth for Accord Housing Association. I started working in community-led housing 30 odd years ago for Accord, for BCHS, which then joined Accord. And so I've had 30 years of supporting cooperatives primarily, but community-led housing generally across the West Midlands, working with fantastic organisations like Starley Housing Co-op in Coventry, right away across the region of working with groups in Birmingham, Sandwell, Dudley, to Bushbury Triangle in Wolverhampton. So I've got experience of working across the region supporting community-led housing. So I suppose the first thing is, why does Accord Housing Association support community-led housing? What's in it for Accord? And I think what's in it for Accord is a value-driven organisation, and its values are about meeting community needs. And community-led housing, by its very essence, meets community-led needs. So why wouldn't we be doing it? If you look at the slide that I've got, you'll see a picture of Sarah, and this is an unashamed little bit of the talk to the councillors in the room. Sarah is somebody that any councillor in this room will be very familiar with, and actually anybody that's been a housing officer in their life will be very familiar with, because she lived in the house with her parents. She shared a bedroom with her sister, but also in that bedroom was her daughter. And she was involved in one of the Redditch cooperative developments, and we started and sat her down in a room and got her to draw her ideal home. And anybody that remembers play school, remember that square house that they drew with the 4 windows and the door and a triangle for the roof? She drew that, but then she drew an oblong behind it, and she drew a triangle at the back of it and 2 stick people around the triangle. And Sarah said, when we asked her to what this was, she said, well, I don't really mind what house I've got, as long as I've got somewhere to live for myself and somewhere where I can push my child on a swing. And that picture that you see there is Sarah standing where the swing was going to be, and the sort of bricks that you might be able to see in the background is where her house was going to be. And isn't that a better relationship for you as councillors, and housing officers to have with Sarah than to have Sarah turning up to your surgery every month saying, I share a bedroom with my daughter and with my sister, and I really need somewhere to live. Because you change the discussion and change the framework from one where you're saying, I know resources are limited and we will get to house you as soon as possible, to one where you can talk about how you're actually going to house her in the future and how that's going and how she's actually housing herself and doing it for herself and having that input to shape the property that she wants herself. So I think really, really important is that increased empowerment of tenants and being able to self-organise and build confidence through that process. And also that there are a range of affordable offers that you get from community-led housing that aren't available otherwise. Sarah actually went on to get a job as a result of being involved in her community-led housing project. And community-led housing leads to all sorts of skills training and employment opportunities. But also, if the community is controlling the repair service in that community, they tend to go to the local community to get their repairs done, to get their work done, to buy their paper, etc., etc. So it recycles the pound in the community in the way that other housing doesn't. I work for a core housing association. It's a large regional housing association. We have a repairs team that's based in Walsall that comes out to repair properties in Coventry, in Solihull, in Worcester, across the West Midlands region. The homes that Sarah lives in employ their own contractors that will all live within 15 minutes of where the houses are. They get a much better repair service than Accord itself can provide because of that closeness and that direct relationship that they have with their contractors. They have a 25 minutes emergency repair service. They have a 48-hour repair service. They're things that Accord would love to be able to offer to all its tenants, but the community-led housing can offer because it is organising those services for themselves. And that makes the communities more resilient. It makes it safer because communities know each other as they're moving in. It makes them far more sustainable and a greater community feeling within those. And the other thing to say is that every piece of research that's been done into community-led housing has said that tenants of community-led housing, residents of community-led housing, are more satisfied than in any other sort of housing. That was done by government agencies when they've done research and satisfaction surveys. It was done when the Commission into Cooperative Housing did its research. It was even done when Price Waterhouse did research into community-led housing. It found that people were more satisfied living in community-led housing than any other sort of housing. The reason Accord does community-led housing is because it works. And it works on the three levels that Abby was talking about in terms of developer-initiated, existing communities and grassroots. The first scheme that I'm going to talk about is a developer-initiated one. We've put together a huge scheme to regenerate a chunk of the town centre of Redditch around Brighton Street, Edward Street area, where there are going to be 240 new homes built in partnership with Pioneer Housing Cooperative. It's part of a £35 million redevelopment of the area. It includes, because of our involvement with residents in the process, we've been on a journey to green our properties, which led to Accord opening a factory as a result of its involvement in community-led housing. And it's also going to include the UK's first virtually plastic-free homes. And it will be starting on site. There's a virtual site opening next, actually, in 23 hours, in a week minus 1 hour's time, next Thursday at 2 o'clock. And if anybody wants to attend that virtual site opening to find out more about that development, you are very welcome to do so. We have the Chief Exec of the Council and the Chief Exec of the Accord Housing Association speaking, along with some other contributions about virtually plastic-free housing and community-led housing. So that's a very, very exciting scheme, and residents are going to be involved in managing those properties as it goes forward. But that is very much at the top end of community-led housing in terms of something that's developer initiated, because Accord believes that the community knows best in how to manage the housing when it's built. We're also working with a range of other community-led housing schemes. and I'm going to take you through just a couple to give examples around existing communities and grassroots type initiatives. The first one I'm going to talk about is Stourbridge Community Development Trust, who are developing 12 apartments and a makerspace for creatives. They've got their planning application in for the Stourbridge Powerhouse at this very moment in time. We expect it to be determined probably in October because of a few COVID delays. This came about because the local community were in opposition to the proposals to build on the old art college in the town, and they wanted to see something better. But they sat down and they thought, well, we don't want to see the art college built for the standard housing, but we do need to have something that works in terms of housing, that keeps money within Stourbridge, but also provides something for creatives within the town, and creates a space where people can work and live and be creative within Stourbridge and help our local economy. And that's how Stourbridge Community Development Trust was born, and that is where the Stourbridge Powerhouse comes from in its origins. It should get planning permission in October and hopefully be on site towards the end of the spring, and it's a fantastic development in Dudley. Existing community organisations, I think Sturchley Cooperative Development is probably a really good example of that. They've also got their planning application in at the moment, and it will also probably be determined in October. We're down to one final point of agreement in terms of what the colour of the cladding will be with Birmingham City Council, and so we're almost over the line in terms of making that a reality. I always talk about Sturchley Cooperative Development as building utopia, because it was a group of people that left university probably 10 years ago now, 8 years ago now. They left university and it was after the financial crash, so none of them could get onto the housing market. They created a range of businesses which has made Sturchley High Street the trendiest high street in the UK, apparently, according to the newspapers. Those businesses found a number of things. One, that every 6 months the people that were working in those worker cooperatives were having to move because they were in insecure accommodation in the private rented sector, and that wasn't good for them putting down roots in their local community. But two, the business premises that their businesses were operating from, that their cooperatives were operating from, weren't fit for purposes. So there was a bakery and a cookery school, and it was operated in premises that were built a long time ago and had been adapted for their needs. There was an art gallery and cafe, which again was in premises that weren't really suitable for an art gallery and a cafe. And there was a bike shop, which was operating in an old shop that wasn't fit for the modern day. So what they've done is created a sort of leave at work utopia where they put housing above that will be affordable housing for the community. And below it, they've created premises for their worker cooperatives to operate from. They've negotiated with a private developer to buy a site, to get an option on the site, and they will shortly get planning permission and then be able to move to build their houses. That's actually an old plan of the site because they've managed to negotiate with the council to get rid of the cars from inside the forecourt now, so it will be a car-free internal development in terms of the courtyard, which they're very, very happy with, and is their utopia, a low carbon, energy efficient, a number of community organisations, a housing cooperative and the 3 worker co-ops that have come together to make a fantastic space that will become a reality in due course. I've then put in Selly Oak Community Development Trust, which is not a million miles away from Sturchley, but is a completely different solution from a different section of the community to similar problems. They were faced with the hollowing out of the local community and pressure on local services as a result of the growing student population in that area. And their response, when a piece of land was made surplus by the local authority, was to look to see if they could build it for themselves and build it as large family housing in order to make sure there were children in the area that would use services to protect services across the community as part of an attempt to regenerate what they call the civic quarter. There are a couple of other buildings. There's a library that the council have had to close down that they're looking to bring back into a productive community use, and there are 3 other buildings as well that they're trying to regenerate in that civic quarter. And they're a little bit further behind in the process than the 2 that I've just talked about, but they're working on that process. And then the final one that I've put there, who are at a similar stage to Selly Oak, is an existing housing co-op looking to build. It'll actually be 12 new apartments now when it's built within the existing area in which that housing operates. It exists in order to build and grow that housing cooperative. So there you can see there are a range of models that have been used in terms of both tenure, in terms of both live and work, in terms of client group that are being used by the community. The thing that they have in common is that the community has come together in different ways to try and address a real problem, which is the housing shortage in their community and the need for high quality, affordable housing within that community. And our experience of providing support and technical advice and services to community-led housing cooperatives backs up that research that I talked about at the start, that people that live in community-led housing are more satisfied than people that live in other forms of housing because they've helped shape it themselves. And that picture shows Steph designing the house that she now lives in on a piece of paper as a start of the process, which is always a good way to go, I think. I've tried to show that that large housing associations can support community-led organisations to deliver community-led housing in a range of ways, building on the work that Tom and Abby said in terms of giving a national policy framework and a framework for community-led housing to exist in. And I think AFSAL is going to go even more local in a second. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Carl. Really some inspiring sort of projects being developed there. Our next speaker is Afzal Hussain, who is currently Chief Officer of Witton Lodge Community Association, an award-winning dynamic social business regenerating some of the UK's most challenging neighbourhoods. Afzal has led multi-million-pound redevelopment programmes working across the public and private sector, combining commercial acumen with social purpose to deliver change that sticks. Over to you, Afzal.
Great, thank you very much for that. I didn't like the way you said he's currently Chief Officer. I'm wondering whether you know something that my board hasn't mentioned to me.
I'm just reading what's written here, Afzal. You know, there might be a message waiting for you after the meeting.
Let's see whether I can load the presentation. Okay. Is that up on your screens?
Yes, that's all.
Good, good. Thank you very much for that. And can I just say, God, I mean, this is okay, but it's not a substitute for kind of being with colleagues and in front of folks. So I've had a look on the participant list, and it's good to recognize some of the names. So hopefully we'll have some time for questions, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to meet and return to some kind of normality. So in the next 10 minutes, I suppose just following on, I want to kind of provide a local perspective to community-led housing from a community-led organisation, a community-based organisation. So Witton Lodge Community Association based in Perry Common, King's Standing, Erdington constituency in North Birmingham. The themes I want to touch on are obviously homes and housing, which is very important, but also within the context of neighbourhoods and what that means. Homes are really important as an end in themselves, but they're also community assets. There is an economic value attached to those. It's a way of creating, retaining wealth in local communities, and particularly around the kind of local agenda of community wealth building, local economic development. I think really important part of regenerating neighbourhoods and communities. I've spent some time working for 2 local authorities, Birmingham here and Coventry, on area-based programs. We haven't had one of those for a little while, and I can't see that returning anytime soon. So something about organic development and growth, and again, community-led housing certainly has a role to play in that. And the final theme, obviously, is people. People kind of, and tenacity of local residents, tenacity of officers, politicians to make things happen. And if you can really get ownership, control, benefits flowing locally in the hands of local people and local stakeholders, then I think we have more of a chance of sustaining some of that change, that we look for through redevelopment. So it goes beyond that. The key reason why community-led housing, if you are kind of involved in housing, you will no doubt have come across kind of the term the housing market being dysfunctional, and there are a number of reasons and kind of measures that you can use behind that. But what I would say is, I mean, we've known this for years. We've known this for at least the best part of a decade, if not longer. And yet the responses that we've had to date have been very similar. They've tinkered with the edges a little bit, but actually it's a similar kind of type of response. So what do we need to do to kind of shift the dial on that? The 2 things that give me some hope and some confidence, one, which isn't necessarily about community-led housing, but it's actually the return of municipal house building. So local authorities coming back in and developing housing. I think it's really important. Birmingham is doing it. Wolverhampton has its own development company. There may be others as well. So that's really positive. And the other is community-led housing. And in many ways, actually, community-led housing is going back to the roots of housing. Before the kind of, mass building kind of post kind of war, actually, housing was a local endeavor, both building and management. And the origins of many of our housing associations that we've recognized now started in very small charities, churches, and people who wanted to do good. So I just wanted to kind of set a little bit of that as a kind of a theme and a tone to the next few minutes. The origins of Witton Lodge really back in 1989, and I've called it community trauma because it really was. So Perry Common was an estate kind of overspilled to places like kind of Aston and Perry Bar. It was developed. Thinking back to post-war, there are various types of kind of construction because house building had to happen at a pace and lots of building went up. Unfortunately, not all of that stood the test of time, and that was the issue here. So about 1,000 properties were found to be defective in Perry Common, and local residents were told initially that they could be repaired, but upon further kind of investigation found that they could not be repaired and would need to be demolished. And that was really the kind of call to arms, call to action. I've just called it kind of planning and mobilizing, and the partnership with the Birmingham City Council. That is not to be understated. It's true to say that the association wouldn't be here if the local authority had not been imaginative and worked with the local community, brought in some advisors and said, actually, how can we make this happen? And one of the things I think in the city, other colleagues have mentioned, kind of rich heritage. I think we're bloody rubbish at telling the good news stories and the kind of work that has already taken place, the learning and the development from that. So that relationship with the local authority here has been absolutely key, and we maintain that relationship, up to now. The association was actually established legally in '94 as a charitable entity and community-led. We have a resident majority on our board, so of a board of 12, 8 of those are local residents. And really since 95 till about kind of 2000, the next 15 years, the work focused on master planning, development design, etc. And a lot of that work was kind of outsourced to the council, housing associations being involved in that. In that process, Witton Lodge itself developed and owned properties. Now there's a kind of a lot of detail sitting behind that, and maybe we can pick that up in the questions. But the other things to mention, in 2010, the board really decided, along with the physical change that we were seeing, there were a number of community issues, particularly around poor health and unemployment worklessness that they wanted to do something about. Took the decision in 2012 that it wanted to take on the management of the housing as an entity in itself, and really decided that it wanted to employ staff. And I joined 2012. So the history of and the story of Perry Common is, you'll find actually in other neighbourhoods, communities in the region, people have those stories, and those are really important, because that's what often is the drive to making things happen. Similar to that, I suppose, is what's the value and ethos and principles sitting behind this. And for us, it is championing what we call community-led solutions. So regardless of whether we're talking about housing, health, employment, we're saying that actually if you work with and alongside the community, you get better results. And and locally here, we have some evidence to prove that that's the case. The other point, I suppose, and this is pertinent to discussing development and housing, that often development is seen as this thing that happens to you. Someone will rock up and say, here's some plan, we want to do this, and you may be consulted, or you may not, and then something happens. There is something about human scale, something that we can understand and appreciate and relate to. And community-led housing, I think, has is an opportunity to do that. And redevelopment itself, it's not enough. Long-term stewardship, management, ownership of the homes and neighbourhoods alongside that, really important. And we've used the opportunity to think more broadly in terms of the health and economic well-being of our local community. Health, as you would understand it, in terms of local health centres, but also social prescribing, which I know a number of you will be familiar with. And particular point about jobs and skills support as well. And really for this to be underpinned by community infrastructure and a sense of spirit and people feeling and being able to do what needs to be done, having control over their lives in their homes and their neighbourhoods in their communities. And there are different ways of measuring that success. And again, maybe we can return to that in the questions. I'm not going to go through this because colleagues have already covered what some of the definitions are on that. But for us, as a local organisation, we've been involved in all aspects of the design, development, and the management of those homes in our neighbourhood. A total of 912 new homes over the past 25 years have been developed, new parks, health and community facilities. As a result, the association now owns 190 homes, and I'm sat in Perry Common at the moment, so they're all within about a 10-minute walk from here. And we also have a 40-apartment sheltered scheme called Sycamore Court. In terms of that new build, the last scheme that we did was in 2015 of 20 new build homes, and you can see the cost of that. But importantly, as the redevelopment has completed here, we've tended to focus our efforts also on empty properties, which are causing a blight in the local area. And we've tended to kind of work a little bit outside of Perry Common, but still within the general vicinity. And in the last couple of years, we've bought, refurbished, and rented out 8 empty properties. This is just to give you a sense that if you do this kind of stuff, what it does do is it gives you a capability and capacity to look at capital projects other than just housing. So I mentioned the empty properties, which you can see on the top left-hand corner. We're actively working with the City Council on a large site in a neighbouring area to us in Wiley Birch, which is focusing on homes and allotments, developing some housing, but also improving the allotment site there. We're in the very final stages of finalising proposed to develop an environmental hub to tackle fuel poverty on the one hand, but also thinking about renewable technologies. The actual hub is situated in the park, and also talking to the local authority and others in terms of how do we use green and open spaces better to promote health and well-being. And we're also working in the local town centre, proposing to bring back a redundant former swimming pool site as an enterprise facility. So transferable skills and capacity and capability that's developed. I like this slide. I think it implements what you've heard already. Land, finance, building, really important to think about housing. But actually, if you can underpin that with community control and be clear on what that community benefit is, then you go some way towards creating a flourishing neighborhood. For us, particularly as an organization, that looks a little like this. There are some numbers which hopefully you can see. So on the, you can see there's information about some of the homes that we currently own and manage. But alongside that, advice services have been really important, not just with the pandemic, but even prior to that. So we provide housing advice services, not just for our own residents and tenants, but the wider community. We've supported over nearly 350 people with jobs and skills, just shy of 500 people with health and well-being activities, and there's a wide range of work that we do there. I've mentioned the environment and the development of the environmental facility, working with the City Council, taking on services in 2 local libraries where we deliver some of these services now. We're fortunate, we're blessed that we have a number of active volunteers who give up their time, and you'll see somewhere in the region of 8,000 volunteer hours that we've benefited from in the last year. And also communication. This type of communication is great, but actually we've found that just being able to produce newsletters, etc., there's a real value still to doing that. And the final thing, you've heard from Abby already, I think we've been real keen supporters of trying to get community-led housing as part of the normal discourse when we've been thinking about housing development and management. So I'm really pleased that West Midlands Urban Community Homes has been established, and really want to work with the guys that you see on screen, but others to make this more of the kind of new normal when it comes to housing development and management, but also thinking about neighbourhoods and regeneration too. I'm going to leave it there, I think.
We've now got time for just a few minutes, I think, for some questions. Some questions have been coming through on the chat and the Q&A, and so I'd like to ask just try and summarise that to the panellists. I'm going to get ready to unmute yourselves if you are on mute. There's a question from Councillor Mayton, I think, which sort of started this off, is about, well, how do you acquire this land? There's obviously a lot of lands that we're talking about is in control of local authorities. And how do we think the proposed plan and regulation changes are going to impact this? And do you think there's an opportunity for more community-led housing to grow as a result of that? Who'd like to go first? Afsar, you moved there.
Oh, did I? I was actually looking at the questions on the Zoom.
It's probably one for Tom, isn't it? I would have thought.
Yeah.
It's a sort of national policy question.
Okay.
Sorry, Tom.
That's all right, Carl. So particularly in urban areas, public land has been a pretty important source of land for community-led housing groups, particularly in higher value urban areas where the private land market can sometimes be difficult for, particularly if you're a new group, if you're an existing organisation like a housing co-op, some of the ones that Carl talked about, or if you're backed by the likes of a Accord, you're more able to trade in the land market. But public land has been a significant source of land, not always, well, rarely free, not always at a discount. And where councils have sold land or leased land at what's considered below market value, it's usually on the basis of the wider social value that gets unlocked by that, and the long-term value that brings to the area, the kind of things that Afsar was talking about, achieving through Witton Lodge. And there are, there are obviously rules around this. There's a good toolkit that was produced by HACT Corp, which is clhtoolkit.org, which is for local authorities to understand how they can engage with community-led housing. And that includes some short material produced by Anthony Collins, solicitors, on the rules around this, around how much you can offer a discount on land within Treasury rules without having to go to the government for approval. And some local authorities have been quite creative in thinking, how do we maximise the long-term social and economic and environmental value of this land for our community, rather than just thinking of it as an asset with the current capital value, in this year, which we might get. And obviously, very much appreciate the impact that austerity has had on local government finances, but I think it's definitely something that's worth considering. And also looking at the way the planning, as I said, planning policy can help to shape the release of land across an area, and regeneration plans. And there are all these other ways in which local authorities can facilitate access to land for community-led housing besides offering up its own. On the planning reforms, we're just taking our time to really digest them. What's difficult is that the planning white paper is quite vague, it's quite high level, it's quite hard to say what sort of system might come from its proposals. And even if you look at growth areas, that presents potentially real opportunities for community-led housing organisations, particularly if land is specifically being allocated for community-led housing, and also if it can give a greater degree of certainty and reduce the risk for groups bringing sites forward. But it could equally kind of reduce the opportunities for groups to access land. And then the thing about design codes, it's very unclear what those design codes would cover. Are they just kind of aesthetics, like this is the kind of cladding that the Carl's working with is allowed, it has to be red, not green, or is it, the kind of wider issues of design, sustainability and so on. So I think it's very hard to say with the planning white paper at the minute, but certainly with the current system, there are a lot of tools that local authorities can use to facilitate access to land. And I think as we're all talking about, as Afsal talked about at the end as well, it's becoming more the mainstream part of the conversation. These conversations go on all the time with other housing associations, other developers, through development forums and so on, looking at how to improve access to land and improve the outcomes on land in the area. And it's just bringing community-led housing organisations into that conversation.
I would also say that I think there are some things around land that can be done to make better housing being built for communities, and that better housing being community-led. If you look at Europe, I've had the privilege of going and seeing Freiburg, which was meant at one point and probably still is the greenest city in Europe. I've also had the pleasure of hearing about places like Vienna, where they've taken a definite policy where there's been major redevelopments of those cities and towns to make sure that they're community-led. And that hasn't stopped the private house sales and developments taking place, but it's put them into a framework where the community lead that major extension or regeneration of the town and city. And I think we perhaps miss a trick in the UK by not doing that. And I certainly think if there are extensions proposed by the combined authority to the West Midlands urban area or new settlements as part of the proposals, then that should be something the West Midlands combined authority gives thought to. And when we started to have conversations with them to try and achieve that. And so when Kevin says, I think we should have them more in greenfield areas, where greenfield areas are being built on, I absolutely agree it should be community-led and controlled. And that would create the best possible way to make this happen. In terms of then land itself and the general flow of land, it has been a long time since I've seen a council gift any land for a community-led housing project. It's only happened once in my life, and very much the norm is that community-led housing projects pay the going rate for land and make the land work in a way where they are hitting a niche and therefore able to make it viable. So in the Sturtshire project, for example, the density means that they can achieve the land value that would be wanted. In the Stourbridge project, they found a piece of land that nobody would want, and that they can make work in a meaningful way because they're doing it in a sustainable and environmentally friendly way. And in the Redditch way, Tom was right in terms of requiring Accord Housing Association's resources to do the land assembly package to make a community-led housing project work. There are all sorts of different ways in which you can access the land, and land is a key issue and a key driver, and I'm sure the changes in planning policy will have an impact on that. But I also think at a regional and local level, decision makers can shape the framework to be productive and positive for community-led housing.
Well, I just mentioned, Keith, I think the issue of planning is kind of really interesting and important. One of the issues with land is that the value, once you have planning permission for housing development, that's when the kind of value kind of skyrockets often. But actually, by working with the community pre-planning, I think there are ways of looking at how you can work with communities ahead of that. So even, and I understand completely the point about kind of, local authorities and other public bodies requiring funds, and I don't imagine that situation is going to change. But I think we can think about how, planning is used.
If you look at Europe, I've had the privilege of going and seeing Freiburg, which was meant at one point and probably still is the greenest city in Europe. I've also had the pleasure of hearing about places like Vienna, where they've taken a definite policy where there's been major redevelopments of those cities and towns to make sure that they're community led. And that hasn't stopped the private house sales and developments taking place, but it's put them into a framework where the community lead that major extension or regeneration of the town and city. And I think we perhaps miss a trick in the UK by not doing that. And I certainly think if there are extensions proposed by the combined authority to the West Midlands urban area or new settlements as part of the proposals, then that should be something the West Midlands combined authority gives thought to. And when we started to have conversations with them to try and achieve that. And so when Kevin says, I think we should have them more in greenfield areas, where greenfield areas are being built on, I absolutely agree it should be community led and controlled. And that would create the best possible way to make this happen. In terms of then land itself and the general flow of land, it has been a long time since I've seen a council gift any land for a community-led housing project. It's only happened once in my life, and very much the norm is that community-led housing projects pay the going rate for land and make the land work in a way where they are hitting a niche and therefore able to make it viable. So in the Sturtshire project, for example, the density means that they can achieve the land value that would be wanted. In the Stourbridge project, they found a piece of land that nobody would want, and that they can make work in a meaningful way because they're doing it in a sustainable and environmentally friendly way. And in the Redditch way, Tom was right in terms of requiring Accord Housing Association's resources to do the land assembly package to make a community-led housing project work. There are all sorts of different ways in which you can access the land, and land is a key issue and a key driver, and I'm sure the changes in planning policy will have an impact on that. But I also think at a regional and local level, decision makers can shape the framework to be productive and positive for community-led housing.
Can I just mention, Keith, I think the issue of planning is kind of really interesting and important. One of the issues with land is that the value, once you have planning permission for housing development, that's when the kind of value skyrockets often. But actually, by working with the community pre-planning, I think there are ways of looking at how you can work with communities ahead of that. So even, and I understand completely the point about kind of, local authorities and other public bodies requiring funds, and I don't imagine that situation is going to change. But I think we can think about how, planning is used to the benefit of local communities in that sense, and being a bit more kind of creative and imaginative. There's also a way of definitely working in partnership with the local authority in terms of development, particularly where they are house builders in their own right, to see what role communities can play. And often the investment upfront means that those properties are kind of better managed in the longer term. So I think there are opportunities for joint kind of working in partnerships, and also just being a little creative in terms of the financing of these things. That actually, if they can take some of the kind of development risk upfront, it means some of the repayment may well be made, beyond that period, which is affordable for community organisations, community-led organisations to manage. And I suspect even in our own region, there are a number of examples where that has happened or could potentially happen, that we can take this forward. And that's the kind of stuff that we want to be really looking at through West Midlands urban community homes in terms of the kind of practice that exists, and you know, what people may be open to considering, because I think that this is the time for innovation, a bit of fresh thinking, and to, you know, try different approaches to see how we can shift that dial in terms of how things have happened before.
Great, thanks. Perhaps I'll start with Abigail here, but this is a more general question, which is what obstacles are in the way of communities coming forward with schemes and ideas, and what can we do to help them overcome those obstacles?
So I think access to land and finance are often big obstacles, and that's why we need the kind of creative thinking that Afzal's talking about there, to think differently about those things. And a few people have talked about land already, and in terms of the finance, I think somebody asked also, how dependent are we on the Community Homes Fund? That is kind of a big area of uncertainty for the sector, but it's not the only way to fund these projects. So on the finance side, for example, there are other things that local authorities can do and do around the country, getting kind of more creative with finance. So other local authorities, they use commuted Section 106 sums, second homes council tax, retained right to buy receipts, to provide kind of pots of grant funding or capital for revolving loan funds to support the pre-development work and the land acquisition for community groups. And others are looking at using prudential borrowing, so their access to the public works loan board to provide finance at a smaller kind of margin and a more affordable rate for projects.
I was wondering if there were other sort of more cultural problems, some barriers to overcome, or there if a community identifies a plot of land and want to do something, how can we make sure they've got, you know, how to take an idea forward?
Well, I think you're right in saying that. I working in Redditch, I did a lot of work with the former leader of Redditch Council, Bill Hartnett, and he always used to say that cooperative housing was the UK's best kept secret. And I think that's part of the problem that we face, that despite me, Abby and Tom and Afzal going round, and Guy from Birmingham City Council going round and shouting about community-led housing from the rooftop, we've only got very small voices in a big ocean. And so part of it is making sure that communities know about the options for community-led housing, and that's often not the case. It's also about making sure local authorities know about the options for community-led housing. One of the things that Birmingham has started doing that we haven't mentioned today is on Castle Vale, working with a community-led housing project to build the housing that the City Council owns and then becomes a community-led housing that the city builds itself. And that's the city providing community-led housing in a direct way. So there are all sorts of ways in which community-led housing can be made to work and shaped to work, but often there is a thing about people not having the knowledge and the information. And also there is a cultural thing that we have to face in the UK, I think, and a cultural issue there, in that the UK housing has been polarised between owner occupation as a model and a sort of paternalist rented model by the state or by charitable housing associations as a model of provision, and community-led housing sits between the sits between the two and overlaps on both ends really in certain ways, and so it's not very well known because of that, and we have a problem in terms, I think, of overcoming that paternalistic or owner occupation obsession that we have in the UK.
Just on that, Keith, just finally, I mean, not to repeat any of that, but it is a mindset. I mean, I know a number of groups and organisations who look at a dilapidated community centre and kind of think, oh, you know, what can we do with that? And yet you'd go past an empty property and in their neighbouring community, and they wouldn't kind of look at that in the same way. And so I think there is something just in that, in the way that's already been described. So it is about changing hearts and minds, and also saying that actually it's possible. This is doable. There's a you know, it's. I'm not saying it's not complex, but it's not complicated. I mean, and there is plenty to be going at. I know we've been talking about kind of build on kind of public land and green or brownfield sites, but actually the number of empty properties that there are in just in this city that you know, we need to have a good go at, because they're sitting there. They're a blight on our neighbours and our communities, and there are people on waiting lists. And so actually, part of that issue, there's an immediate problem, and I think in that empty property issue, there is something that community-led housing can certainly you know, respond to.
Brilliant. Thanks. We just had a question, Chris, about whether this webinar is going to be posted on LinkedIn or on another.
That certainly is the plan, Keith.
Great.
All being well.
Okay. I think we're now coming up about 4:15. I was just wondering if there are any more sort of pressing questions from the group, or should we draw this to a close now? I think that's, yeah, we're getting some very positive responses. So I think we should draw that to an hours. I'd very much like to thank Carl, Afzal, and Abigail and Tom for this, for contributing the time today. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. We share the information, as Chris has said afterwards, on a number of locations, and participants will be contacted with those, attendees will be contacted with the details on that. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you agree that this has been a great start for the Centre for the New Midlands, and thank you very much, everybody.